I think that the first thing that we have to do is to normalize and to get comfortable with the idea of mortality. I think that that's what's missing from the entirety of the process. And so as we put so much energy into this idea of singularity and the idea of immortality, anti-aging is like this
Mm.
billions-dollar business in the United States, and everybody is looking to forego the aging process, and we're all doing what we can to stay younger, and I'm part of that too. I don't want to age any faster than I have to. The point is that there's a denial of mortality and a delusion that we are meant to live forever, and you know what? We're not.
Welcome to the First Responder Families podcast, sponsored by Shadowproof at FHE Health, a nationally recognized behavioral health provider. I am your host, Ivona Bhadha, a director of family services at FHE Health and a family, couples, and trauma therapist. Join me for meaningful conversations and talks that support wellness and mental health of first responders and their families. Hello, listeners of First Responder Families podcast. This is your host, Ivona Bhadha, again, and I have an incredible guest here with me. His name is Eric Bricker, and he is well known, accomplished South Florida psychotherapist. He specializes in trauma resolution, substance use disorders, anger management, and also grief work, which we will be focusing today. And the world knows him also from a very popular podcast, The Good Counsel. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you so much for having me, Ivana. I appreciate it. And yeah, and thank you to all your listeners for having me as well. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
Awesome. I have to tell you that your voice sounds very soothing. So I think that I'm just imagining when you are helping people to navigate through grief, that could be really a nice anchor of safety, just your voice. And in addition to your experience and everything, what you know about grief work. And I'm curious about how you got into being interested in helping people navigate grief.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of us down here in South Florida, it was a little bit of an offshoot from the world of addiction recovery. Most of us, many of us here, start our careers working in these residential treatment centers because that's kind of the behavioral health industry in the area that we work.
Mm-hmm.
And within that population, there are all of these subpopulations of people. Some people, it's eating disorders and addiction, and some people it's trauma and addiction. And that was really more where I started was the trauma and substance use disorders. And then from there, recognizing that there was a lot of issues related to grief and loss for a number of different reasons. Specifically, I started to notice that a lot during the opioid epidemic as fentanyl was introduced, and more and more people essentially were just dying from drug overdoses. Those people are often the friends and family members of the clients that we treat. So it's more and more so among the substance using population. You had people being impacted significantly by all of this grief that they were experiencing. So it was just kind of occurred naturally,
Mm-hmm.
and I had additional credentialing from that for that from other work I had done previously, and it just sort of naturally found myself doing more and more grief work and attending to it, and yeah, it just became a subspecialty that I do.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking about it today, how many of us started in addiction facilities, and we found later we found ourselves to be more focused on trauma and grief work because somehow it seems like addictions may be the symptoms of unresolved issues around trauma and incomplete grief. Yeah.
I think so. And I think that there's a correlation and an association with unresolved grief and untreated grief issues that makes people more at risk for substance use disorders. And
Mm,
I think it's the unresolved grief that often makes it
mm,
difficult for people in recovery to have more of a quality recovery if they don't address these issues. So it's all layered in there,
mhm.
and it's all part of it for I think not every person, but for a lot of people certainly.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Many people, I think, um, consider grief as connected just to dying process or losing someone significant, which is understandable. That's how we maybe connect with grief. Would you speak to maybe other types of grief, or grief that is not as recognized as grief of losing loved one?
Sure. Well, there's a number of different kinds of grief. I think we could talk about what we call grieving the loss of dreams, and that occurs with a number of different losses. It often occurs with divorces or with
Mm-hmm.
raising children who don't necessarily meet expectations or having certain careers. Sometimes you'll have an athlete that got only so far and didn't have the sort of experience that they had worked their whole life toward. And so the pivoting from one kind of reality into another where things didn't work out the way that we had hoped, or we're not living the life that we had hoped to live, that's a huge one. I think often there are certain transitions that cause grieving the loss of a role. So let's say you were the CEO of a corporation for years and years, and then you retire at 65 years old, and you still are energetic and you still feel like you can wake up in the morning and run a company of 5,000 people, but there's no company to run. And you can lose your whole identity behind that because all of your purpose and meaning, or what you believe to be your purpose and meaning, or what had historically been your purpose and meaning, is removed. And now you have to kind of find a whole other reason to exist. And all of these different things create massive challenges for people. So I think grieving is really a process of transitioning. And along the way, we lose things
Mhm.
because nothing stays the same, right? Nothing lasts forever, as cliche as that is, it's also true. And so we're constantly transitioning to different phases of our life where the previous phase is past.
Mhm.
Some people have a difficult time graduating high school and moving on to whatever comes next, where they feel like they peaked at 17 years old as a high school senior, and there's nothing to look forward to. You see it um, in all stratas of society, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it made me to think about our first responders that we treat at FHE Health and how they have a difficulty to lose their role, for example, with retirement or when they lose their jobs due to mental health issues and maybe consequences. And it is a huge loss of identity for them. So I think that's very relatable to first responders who can get very attached to helping and saving lives.
A few years back, I was working in a residential program that had, I was doing trauma work in a residential program that had a military and first responder program embedded into it. So there was a lot of overlap because
Mm-hmm.
the military clients and the first responder clients were participating in the trauma work. I was seeing some of these people for
Mm-hmm.
EMDR, and they were coming to the trauma groups. And what was described from that is what I think is referred to that it was a term that I was introduced to while I was working there.
Mm-hmm.
Is called transitional trauma. And transitional trauma is a common thing among first responders and a common thing among um, military
Mm-hmm.
where there are retirements or where we're stepping away after deployments or we're stepping away after leaving work due to disability, where you lose a lot of stuff because it's not just the job and the identity, it's also an entire community with
Mm-hmm.
a very strong in-group. Like you're part of that, you're part of a fraternity, you're part of a family of these first responders and these people who really have this inside knowledge, is this experience that is very unique among human experiences in
Mm-hmm.
our society. They do a very unique thing and they share a lot in common. So you become part of this brotherhood or sisterhood.
Yeah.
And when you leave that, I think that that's very jarring for people in terms of being disconnected from this massive support system. So you lose the role, you lose the identity, and you also lose this community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really that transitional trauma. I think that's very real, and it, I think a lot of these guys are experiencing that as a grieving process and
Mm-hmm.
kind of redefining your role of who you are in the world after leaving something like that. Huge challenge for a lot of these people.
Eric, I appreciate you how you described it, how you named it. I actually felt energetically somewhat that heaviness that, just partially that heaviness what they have to experience as a huge loss. Yeah. When they retire or, change their jobs or yeah. Mm.
Well, you think about it, this is sort of like a ridiculous example to use,
Mhm.
but the movie Rambo that came out in the 1990s is about it's Sylvester Stallone plays a Vietnam veteran who is had incredible difficulty reintegrating himself into society after being involved in war and being like a high level operator in
Mhm.
war. And in one of the scenes where he's trying to explain himself and how difficult it has been because no one's really being understanding of his
Mhm.
side of things. And he said, I've gone from being in charge of $1 million equipment,
Mhm.
millions of dollars of equipment, this machinery and equipment that I was in charge of, and being involved with these people and talking to high level members of the government and all these people working with me in this sense that what we're doing is really, really important. And now I can't even get like a regular job and I'm being harassed by these local cops and all of this different stuff. And I think for him, that was that's sort of like a very real example, probably extreme in the way that Hollywood does things, but I think not far off from what some of these guys experience, where they have these really important, high level, skilled tasks that they're expected to perform on a daily basis with such levels of intensity involved in what they're trying to do. And that is lost to where you have to navigate your way back into civilian life, which I imagine is probably quite boring to these guys, or it's quite an adjustment when you think about like what they were doing to what they're expected to do now. And that probably feels like a significant loss and probably very disorienting.
Yeah. Yeah. Just really going through a lot of adjustment while there is a loss of many, many different losses. And yeah, and they do live in contexts. Many of them have families or married, have children, and that's where also the family system dynamics appear. When someone is going through this maybe unrecognized grief and maybe some mm, pushed down trauma as well. And now you have the family members who are holding space for it as best as they can. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Eric, and you did mention grief process, so it already implies that grief is not just some sort of emotion, or it's not just something that um, will go away, but it is a complex work, to navigate through grief. How would you describe it to listeners, who are listening right now, how who definitely have, like all of us, some kind of grief and loss we went through.
So you got a couple of challenges there for us as a society for two reasons. One, we are a death denying culture. We don't, this is a topic that we generally will avoid if we
Hmm.
can. It's a thing that is uncomfortable for people, and we don't like to think about it. We don't like to talk about it. If you think about it like this, you take a child raised in the United States. By the time they're 7 years old, they know how to write their name in cursive. They know their address. They know where they go to school. They know what a friend is. They know what a home is. They probably know what a job or a career is. They know what money is. But ask them what death is, they probably have some idea, but the question is, who's responsible for teaching you that? Who's responsible for teaching children about death in our society? And it's a rhetorical question because the answer is really no one. You could say it's the parents, you could say it's the, clergy or religion, you could say it's the school, but no one really takes that on. And I think we end up sort of avoiding teaching children about death until someone actually dies. And then there are programs and books written about it and counselors to go see to explain it to you after you've lost someone, which in a way is really like teaching somebody how to swim while they're actually drowning. And that's the context in which we actually learn about grief is when we are experiencing it. So I think we have this death denying culture that looks to avoid this very uncomfortable subject matter. I think that's one piece of it. And the other part of it is that we have been bogged down by a little bit of misinformation. And I'm going to explain myself.
Okay.
So what most of us have been given is this Kubler-Ross five stages of grief. That we all know that, right? You hear it spoken about by clinical professionals, you hear it spoken about by lay people, but we all know the five phases of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, eventually acceptance. But we're familiar with those. That's what we hear associated with grief. The fact of the matter is, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the book Death and Dying, where she identified those five phases of grief, her research on grief was really done for the book. It was done on people who had terminal illnesses, right? So these are people in hospitals who have these terminal illnesses that are coming to grips with their own mortality and the inevitability that they were dying.
Hmm.
And so these were the experiences that those people had: denial and bargaining, the anger, and eventually some level of acceptance. This is what she saw with those populations of people that she said, hey, this thing that they all have in common is at some point they all go through these five phases, right?
Hmm.
And somehow or other, our society took this information and we generalized that okay, that is the grief experience. That's what everybody goes through. And I think that speaks to our avoidance of the subject of grief. I think it speaks to our death denying culture that the first time we were exposed to something that can explain the phenomenon of loss, we
Hmm.
just jumped on it and took it
Right.
without, while at the same time overlooking the fact that this material was normed on the wrong population of people. Because the experience of a terminally ill cancer patient who's facing their own mortality, I think it's pretty arguable that that is a different thing than you and I facing the experience of losing a loved one. It's just two different things. So to
Hmm.
say that the phases of grief that were appropriate for these terminally ill people, what they experienced, and what was normed on them in the research, and to say that's the same experience you and I are going to have when we lose family members or parents or change roles, I just like scientifically that doesn't even really
Yeah.
make sense.
I'm so glad that you are talking about this on in this interview because it's just I it never made sense to me when people who weren't going through dying process or let's say someone was dying in their family, like it really didn't make sense to me. And like that they would say, oh, okay, I think I'm in anger stage, of the grief because they really didn't want to navigate through those emotions, the grief, the sadness, fear, and maybe anger also, if anger was there in that particular loss, whether the real tangible loss or let's say other losses, more you mentioned before, losses of identity, losses of dreams. Uh, yeah, we are the
Sure.
culture. We are afraid of that emotions. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, I think so. I think all of those things are true. And and so what's amazing about all of that is that this book, Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, this was written in like 1969 or something like that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you're talking about something that is
Hmm.
nearly like 60 years old, um, and we're still referring to these concepts as though they're what is current.
Hmm.
But there's a more of an emerging body of research that is strongly suggesting that grief doesn't really occur in phases, and that it could really be more divided into to two parts, that you're either in an acute phase or you're in this like integrated phase. And that's more of the modern way of thinking about it. And a lot of this comes from the research out of Columbia University's Center for Prolonged Grief, and it's spearheaded by a woman by the name of Catherine Shear, who is the psychiatrist that is the founder of the Institute at Columbia University. So this is a lot of where the current research and the current thinking is coming from. There's also a lot of research coming out of NYU. I don't think it's coincidental that these are both universities in New York. So it sounds like there's a lot of cross back and forth and co-authorship of research articles as they kind of take a deep dive into the nuances of these topics. But that seems to be where a lot of the modern thinking is coming from.
Hmm. I do want to acknowledge you for continuous research that you do, for while you are highly trained and experienced in your practice, you continue in being a student, so you can apply what you know with what scholars, and professors and researchers do for us.
Well, if you're going to be walking around here saying that what everyone else has been saying about grief and loss for the last 60 years about the five phases of grief, I'm going to be the one to say, if I'm going to be walking around here saying that that's wrong, I better have some basis for that. I
Mhm.
better have
Yeah.
some research or something else that I can point to explain myself because that is so frequently quoted
Mhm.
that it's really just sort of accepted as the truth. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that there's more to be looking at than that idea, and that there's a different way to conceptualize this that's probably more useful and helpful
Mhm.
in terms of understanding the phenomena because it's
Mhm.
more accurate.
Yeah. So I have this silly question or inquiry for you. If you had that power and and all the resources, and you could put billboards, all over 90 Highway 95, and it would be saying something very essential and something research based on grief, how would you put it on billboards? How would you want people to start holding that concept, the grief?
I would say if we were putting it up on a billboard and I could only say one thing about the grieving process, I would say we are like the McRib sandwich. We are only here for a limited time, you know? No, I wouldn't say that, but I'll
Okay.
say that to you.
Thank you
I'll
for
say that to you.
lightening it up.
Yeah, that's it. We're like the McRib sandwich here for a limited time only. No, but in saying that, I think that the first thing that we have to do for everybody is to normalize and to get comfortable with the idea of mortality. I think that that's what's missing from the entirety of the process. And so as we put so much energy into this idea of singularity and the idea of immortality and every you know anti-aging is like this billions-dollar business in the United States, and everybody is looking to forego the aging process, and we're all doing what we can to stay younger. And I'm part of that too. I don't want to age any faster than I have to. But the point is that there's a denial of mortality and a delusion that we are meant to live forever. And you know what? We're not. And
Mhm.
I think as we get back, because there was a period of time when lifespans were just shorter.
Mhm.
And I'm 56 years old. I just turned 56 this past weekend.
Mm.
That if you go back a couple of hundred years ago, that's a very old man, in the 1600s or the 1700s. There weren't so many people that lived to be that age. And so your lifespan was, you didn't necessarily expect to go beyond 40 or 50 years. And I think when these mortality rates were much higher, people had a different relationship with death, that it was normalized, because even infant mortality, like people had these huge families with 10 kids because you
Mm.
expected to lose a couple of them on the frontier.
Mhm.
I mean, it was just what it was, and it was a sad thing, but people understood
Mhm.
that life was more fragile, and they accepted it. And because of that, the idea of grief and the idea of loss is painful. It was no less painful than it is today, but
Mhm.
it was more normalized. And I
Yeah.
think that's a part of the problem with our society.
Mm.
And so I think if there was anything to say about it, it would really be, let's do what we can to have these conversations and normalize it. And let's start these conversations as early as possible so that there's a compassionate and healthy way to educate people on mortality and get you
Mhm.
comfortable with the idea that I am not going to be here forever. My parents are not going to be here forever. My pets are not going to be here forever. And as painful as that is, to normalize that reality so that it becomes a thing that doesn't have to be avoided.
Yeah. It's interesting how how you are describing it, I am imagining first responder community that they encounter death. Sometimes, it's just like the bad week, every day some tragedy and a loss. So they do have it normalized in a sense, more like being desensitized. And I think that's where they may forget that they're human too, meaning that they have hearts and they have sensitivities and they have their triggers as well, triggers for grief and losses. So, yeah, I don't have really an answer for it, but what would you have any invitation to the listeners who are first responders, how to navigate through when they have a really like critical incidents and they see people dying, and how to bring it or not bring it home.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a different thing, right? And so one
Mhm.
thing I know about the first responder community is if you're not part of the first responder community, you got to be careful about what you say as far as trying to interject some kind of level of expertise onto what those guys are experiencing. And I can't really say that I fully understand that, right? I'm an
Mhm.
outsider to that. I will say
Yeah.
this because I know a few of those people and military veterans and all that. I think there's a mentality that they have about you got to keep it moving. That's the way I think about it. You got to keep it moving, and you can't sit around and linger over what happened because
Mm.
if that's you've got a house fire around the corner, or there's going to
Yeah.
be another violent situation or some other emergency right around the corner. You can't be lingering on about what just happened. You gotta be prepared with a blank slate for the next thing, and you can't be because it'll cause hesitation and all of these different things that really puts people at risk, not just you, but the people that you're serving with.
Mhm.
So I think there's a strong mentality about keep it moving. If there was
Mhm.
anything I could say to people, in that situation, it's that hopefully in the breaks between all of this work and this intensity, there's a
Mhm.
quiet space separate and apart from your work where there is someone to talk to about these things. If for no other reason, if you think about it like this, right? I like to think of it like this. When I go to sleep at night and I have dreams, sometimes my most disturbing thoughts, like anxieties, you feel them, they come up in the morning, right? You
Mhm.
tend to dream about them. And sometimes if there's anxiety or any kind of angst in my life, I'm going to know it when I wake up first thing in the morning because it seems to be what's on my mind, right?
Mhm.
And it's a lot that way for people who are trauma survivors and the rest. It's just a lot of intrusive and disturbing thoughts first thing in the morning. So if you think about it like overnight, is this period of time where my subconscious takes its garbage and brings it out to the street. And that's what I'm confronted with in the morning is all of the trash, all of the negative thoughts and disturbing ideas about what I've experienced the previous days or throughout my life that's bothering me. And my brain has brought it to the sidewalk. And that's why I'm thinking about it. So I have to bring it all the way out to the end of the driveway so the truck can pick it up and send it on its way. And I actually do a visualization exercise with people. But along those lines, think about it like if you go through enough things, your brain is going to accumulate some trash.
Mhm.
And if you don't want the trash to kind of spoil your house,
Mhm.
then you have to find a way to gather up your trash and bring it out to the street so that you have a clean house. And in that metaphor, the brain would be your house. So if you spend a lot of your day dealing with trash,
Mhm.
and I'm not talking about people being trash, but I'm talking about
Okay.
the experiences being the
Mhm.
emotional and kind of mental garbage. Well,
Mhm.
you at some point you should gather that all up and bring it out to the driveway, so that someone could pick it up. So that way you can operate with a clean house, clean mind.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
somehow or other, however it is you do it, whether you have a peer group to do it or other
Mhm.
professionals or you have a therapy professional or someone like that.
Mhm.
I think we all, even these heroes, everyone's got to take out the trash at some point.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I would
It's
say. Find someone to take out the trash with.
yeah. So beautiful, beautifully said. Um, mm, Good metaphor, I would say, because the first responders do really deal with very ugly scenes and sounds and smells and certainly just tragedies that they
Well,
witness.
think about it like this. Like I live in Delray Beach, and whatever was the worst thing that happened in my town last night, whatever was the one, everybody in my town might have been having a great time except for one household where there was a tragedy and somebody died.
Hmm.
These guys were there for it. They participate while everybody else is out there celebrating their lives. They are showing up to the house where the worst thing has happened, and they do it day in and day out, where people are dying, where people are in the midst of tragedy. I mean, can you
Hmm.
imagine? And that's day in and day out. Wherever there's a tragedy, uh, these guys are the witnesses to it, you
Hmm.
know?
True.
And so it's like you think about my town, it might have been a perfect night for everybody but one household. And these guys weren't out to dinner with people who were graduating high school, or they weren't
Mhm.
celebrating weddings and doing this thing. They were while everyone else was celebrating, they were at the house, with this bereaved family or this tragic accident, and helping these people figure out how to survive this, and trying to rescue people from whatever it was that was going on. And imagine day in and day out, that's what you're experiencing. What a difficult job. It's a rare individual, I think, that
Mhm.
be able to do something like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that acknowledgement. I really agree. I agree. I have also privileged to work or get to know their spouses or family members, and I would say they are first responders as well because a lot of time, they choose to follow the first responder schedule or even moving to, if they are military, moving to another country, and they really sacrifice their own needs, and so they are the first responder too. In a way, I see it. They are part of the community. Mm.
Yeah, that's a such an interesting way to live one's life, to be
Mhm.
the family member of somebody, because I imagine there's just probably a lot that you don't get to hear. And so if you do
Mhm.
get to hear it, you have to have a certain degree of being able to tolerate what you're listening to and what you're experiencing vicariously through your loved one that's doing this job. And then there's probably a high degree of containment and privacy where we
Mhm.
can't share this stuff with people outside. So you're left hearing about some really difficult things, and not really a community of people to share it with. So I think that kind of falls into this category of vicarious trauma, where in some degree, in a secondary way, you're experiencing as the family member uh, vicariously what your loved one is experiencing, and you have the same problems of who do I share this with, because this is private material. I can't just go and tell my family members or my neighbors or friends about this, and now I have to deal with managing all that information. And I imagine that weighs heavy on those families.
Yeah. Yeah. Carrying it. And that's why I like your imagery. And perhaps I imagine that there's a lot of different emotional hygiene, mental hygiene ways how um, helpers and helpers to helpers need to really take care of themselves and emotionally. And grief would be probably aspect of their lives that may be often suppressed. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. I'm also curious if you would speak a little about what is your most favorite exercise or grief work assignment that you give to your clients.
Well, there's a lot of different things that we do. I think one of the most important ones is so there's a certain goal with the grief work, right? And the goal of grief work is one to reach a place of emotional and cognitive acceptance that our person is not here anymore, and to be able to integrate that because the relationship with the person who's gone, we continue on with that. Like we continue to have, like my father passed away last year, and I
Mm.
may continue to maintain a relationship with him, but I am challenged to maintain a relationship with him because he's not here in my life in the same way. So what he becomes then is an extension of my consciousness. You know, he
Mhm.
exists in my life as part of my consciousness. So it requires, in the same way that to maintain a relationship with a person who's alive requires that I have some connection, right? That I'm calling that person or checking in, or that we make a plan to get together and do things together. I have to, in order to maintain this relationship, I have to create a, I got to call them up,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
I got to call them
Okay.
up. I have to create a conscious way of checking in. So one of the exercises that we do is calling them up, which is on a routine basis, and you kind of decide in therapy what's a healthy amount of time. Because just like with a person that's alive, it would be kind of unhealthy to be on the phone with your mom, 6 times a day, right? That's not a healthy relationship with somebody. Um,
Mhm.
but so I got to figure out what's a healthy amount of time to be calling them up, and I got to commit to doing it in order to be managing my part of the relationship. So one part of the exercise is to figure out what's an appropriate amount of time to be calling,
Mhm.
and two is taking the time to call them up.
Mhm.
And it's awkward for people to imagine calling them up, but the idea of calling them up is to think about the person in your mind in a way that you're communicating them and what you might want to say to them in that moment, right?
Mhm.
So if it's my time to call my dad, I might just check in with him and say, hey, you know what? I don't know. I don't really have much to tell you today. There's not really a whole lot going on, but there's this one thing. I'm doing this podcast today, and it's kind of interesting because normally I'm doing the podcast, but somebody else is hosting this one, and this is a podcast for first responder families, and this is what we're going to be talking about is grief and loss. I might even be mentioning you today, Dad. What do you think about that? And just in my mind to kind of go through this and yeah, just kind of have this little stream of conscious where I'm calling them up and letting them know what's going on, and then maybe I'm taking some time to imagine what he might say about that. What my dad might be saying about that, and what he would think of all, and to think about what he would be thinking about all this. And I
Mhm.
think he'd probably think it was cool. You know. I
Mhm.
think he'd probably think it was cool, and he'd probably be glad I was doing this. And then, the first thing he would say, he'd be like, "What do you know about first responders?" You know, and that's definitely one thing he would say, and he would laugh at me, and then I would tell him what this was about, and he would probably think it was pretty cool. And if he was around, he would want to hear this.
Mhm. I love that example, Eric, and it's kind of touching and I even wanted to communicate with him and say that you know what is cool about Eric that he didn't claim that he knows everything about first responders, that he just shared what he truly knows and he admitted he doesn't know everything about them.
I feel like the worst thing you could do on a podcast like this, especially if you're not like if you don't, if you haven't been part of uniform service and you're not, is to come
Mhm.
on and act like you know all the stuff without that. I just feel like that would go over so badly. Like I hope that this went well, and that we communicated some things that are of some interest to people, and maybe there's something that we discussed that these family members or this community of people would take from our discussion. But the one thing I would never want is for them to all be like, that guy sucked because I talked about a bunch of stuff that I don't understand, and then just offended all of the people who bothered to listen to this because I came on here and tried to claim I was some kind of expert on what these people are experiencing that I haven't done before. That would be terrible and embarrassing. I don't think my dad would like that at all. So you
And
know,
they would
you-
find out right away. But I really enjoyed our conversation, Eric. And to moving from that 60-year-old concept of grief stages, I am, even from our short conversation, what I'm holding here is that grief never really ends. It's just wants to find its place internally, perhaps, whether it's a thing or really significant person you lost, like you are making a special place for it or for them in your heart, and you visit that place until perhaps you make complete the acute grief, then in it maybe feels more completed, and then you are ready for another loss because, like you said in the beginning, the life is always full of changes.
so I think that what we described is really part of what denotes the movement from the acute phase into what's called the integrated phase.
Mhm.
So in the acute phase, you're still like in mourning and you're in all kinds of pain and you haven't been able to integrate, accept this loss. And that's where people are doing the most amount of suffering. And how long that takes is, that's very individual around the relationship and the circumstances surrounding the death and all of these different cultural factors and a whole bunch of different things that sort of factor into the way people mourn and experience grief. Moving into the integrated phase, it's like this person is still gone and it's still a painful thing that they're not with us. And we might have some degree of pain from that on a daily basis, but we've resumed our activities. We're back at work. I'm functioning. I can go to the gym. I can interact with other people. I can do most of the things I was doing before I lost them, at the degree that's expected of me,
Mhm.
even though this person is lost. And that's part of what distinguishes this acute phase of grief from the integrated phase. And part of these types of exercise, like the one I described, is the movement from the acute phase
Mhm.
into the integrated phase,
Mhm.
because I am found a way to integrate this loss by imagining and envisioning this changed relationship that I have with this person who's no longer here, but that I have this commitment of keeping them in my life in some kind of way. And
Mhm.
so that exercise of calling them up is that's one of those exercises that we are using to help people move into integration. How do I maintain a relationship with these loved ones that I've lost? Although that are not here physically, how do I maintain that relationship and still feel connected to them in some kind of way that is meaningful?
Thank you so much. And I really trust that this conversation have brought some hope for folks who are listening. And I really appreciate your time, Eric.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to contribute, especially to a body of work like this, right? That,
Hmm.
knowing who is likely to be listening to this, big honor for me to be able to participate in something like that. Uh, and again, as cliche as it is, for anybody listening to this, to the family members and the first responders, themselves. I would like to end by saying thank you all for your service and thank you all for what you guys are doing on a daily basis to make the world and our communities a safer, better place to live. We all owe you a great debt of gratitude for that.
Yeah, copy that. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. The First Responder Families podcast is sponsored by Shadowproof at FHE Health, a specialized treatment program for first responders with mental health and/or substance use issues. For more information about our show and our services, check out fhehealth.com. The podcast website also has a place where you can share your ideas or questions for future shows. If you are struggling, we want to help. Feel free to call us at 844-714-3403 or visit fhehealth.com. We look forward to having you join us for our podcast next month. Until then, take care.